Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of videos where I will be reading about and discussing 7 different perspectives of the perspectives theory written by C. George Boeree. So, what is the perspectives theory, and why am I talking about it? The perspectives theory is a philosophical theory of mind that asserts that there are 7 relative levels of perceiving reality, and that each of these levels roughly correlates with developmental, spiritual, and personal growth. These 7 perspectives are the autistic, the authoritarian, the rationalistic, the mechanistic, the cybernetic, the epistemic, and the transcendental. Each video in this series will focus on one of the 7 perspectives within the perspectives theory, written by C. George Boeree. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. It may be Boeree. And of course, I'll include a link to his website down below. But first, a little bit about my interest in this subject matter and why I decided to do a video about it. Maybe about a few months ago, in doing some research on personality theory and personality development, I stumbled upon a link to C. George Boeree's website, which he has basically written, several texts about various subjects, psychological and philosophical. First of all, his style of writing and his line of thinking and feeling really resonated with me, which makes sense because where I found the link to his website was actually on this other website that delves into personality structures, and looking under one of the personality structures that I recognize in myself, the leisurely personality. There was several links under there to things that people with that personality type would be interested in. So I clicked this link and I ended up on C. George Boeree's website, and they were totally right. I totally love it. It just clicked right away for me. So many of the ideas and way of thinking that, like I said, they really resonate with me. They really just sort of make sense to me. So yeah, and that's actually what inspired the name of my channel, Epistemia, because one of the 7 perspectives is the epistemic perspective, and so we'll have a video on that particular perspective later on in the series. But it was that perspective in particular that described me to a T, and described my perspective and my life experiences and kind of how I think and feel about the world around me, how I always have thought and felt about the world around me. So the epistemic perspective inspired the name of my channel, Epistemia. So, moving on. So, I'm basically going to be reading directly from what he's written on the website and maybe interjecting some of my own thoughts or feelings as we go along. So, without further ado, we'll just get right into it. So first, he has a couple paragraphs as an intro to the 7 perspectives. And he writes, "Although my intuition leads me to believe that there is ultimately only one reality, infinite and eternal, experience, however, leads me to believe that there are as many views or perspectives of reality as there are conscious creatures. Each of us has a different genetic inheritance, different health histories, different cultural backgrounds, different upbringings, unique individual experiences, and so on. It is a surprise to me that we agree about the world as much as we do. Even more, our views of reality change over the years, and even from moment to moment, as our situations and moods change. It would seem at first that any attempt to reduce these views or perspectives to a few categories or types would be doomed before it even began. But then, study the history of ideas and the development of individual minds suggests to me that perhaps there are a few clusters that we can point to, complexes of ideas that gravitate towards each other. Perhaps because they share some logical connectedness that goes beyond individual variation. The idea of some number of epistemological types, categories, stages, or levels is, of course, nothing new. Many others before me have put forth their thoughts on the matter, and he names a couple people here: Perry, Kohlberg, Piaget, Sorokin. And he continues, and I would like to do the same. The following ideas are extensions of my perspectives theory that were inspired by the work of Rachel Lauer. To be succinct, I have come to believe that we can separate out 7 such perspectives, and that we can further organize them into 3 broader categories as well as into rough developmental hierarchy. So what he's basically saying here in the intro is that reality is infinitely complex, and interpretations of reality are also infinite in possibilities. And so he says that to even try to categorize that would be basically simplifying it in a way that from the very beginning would already be diminishing having a real understanding of that vast complexity. So he acknowledges that. But at the same time, I would add, humans create categories for all different types of things. And we do need to recognize that these categories are constructed. We make them up. They don't really exist inherently in nature or in the universe. Mother Nature and the universe know nothing of our categories and care nothing for our categories, right? It's really a human invention of any sort. But while the idea of having categories is a construction, a conceptual construction, it is still a necessary process in even being able to begin to understand anything in the universe, or the innerverse if you want to talk about what is, inside our brains, our minds, our hearts, some of the more abstract experiences that we have. That starting with categories is a necessary step. It at least gives us some kind of framework to begin to understand. So that's sort of his preface to what we're doing here. Okay. So the first perspective that he has listed here in the 7 perspectives is he has labeled the Autistic Perspective. And this is the perspective that we are going to be focusing on for this video, for our first video. I'm just going to go ahead and read directly from his writings. And then I may interject or, as we go along, or I may, elaborate or expand upon what he's written after. So he writes, the first perspective I call the autistic. I don't believe that anyone is ever completely involved in this perspective, but it is best seen in infants, autistic children, and severely psychotic adults. On the other hand, we all slip into this perspective from one time to another, most obviously when we are dreaming, but also when we engage in instinctive, automatic, and defensive behavior. And he continues, a person taking the autistic view believes that their personal subjective perspective is, in fact, the only perspective, and that, to the extent that the consciousness of others is recognized at all, everyone sees reality this same way. It is, in other words, egocentric and self-oriented, even solipsistic. In infants, and one might presume in animals as well, the autistic perspective is one that stays very close to immediate reality as presented by the senses and feelings. In older children and adults, it is likely to include a perfect faith in one's own construction of reality, including all the differentiations one has learned. In the cases of the psychotic, those differentiations might include some very sophisticated constructions developed prior to the slide back into autism. Symptoms, he uses quotations for the word symptoms, of autistic perception and cognition in normal children and adults include ideas of magic and animism, the idea that other entities, including animals, plants, and even physical phenomena, also perceive and respond to events as that person does. So there are a couple things I want to talk about here. I know that he refers to autism, and I don't know particularly how much this author is familiar with the actual, condition of autism or the various conditions that are on the autistic spectrum. And I remember reading somewhere else in his writings that while he uses the term autistic, he is not necessarily referring specifically to individuals with that named condition. He's using the term autistic in a more loose definition, a more loose concept of what that embodies. So he's not necessarily saying that this perspective defines the perspective of people with autism. That's not what he's saying. Nor is he presenting this perspective as any type of necessarily presenting a value on it, like saying that it's better or worse than any of the other perspectives. But he does present it as the most basic and fundamental perspective, especially when you're looking at, from a perspective of, say, child development. And this is my elaboration. We all start off with that perspective. And it's true if you've ever taken child development courses, or if you are a parent or work with children like I do. Children basically think they're the center of the universe, and I know a lot of people say that as a joke, but it's actually true. They actually do think that they are the center of the universe up until a certain age. I think basically once they get to the terrible twos, as we call them, that's when they are starting to figure out that they are in fact not the center of the universe, and they're sort of trying to challenge that idea, with tantrums and unreasonable behavior. I laugh because I work with a 2-year-old right now, so I'm seeing this every day, and I find it to be very fascinating. But back to what Mr. Boeree here is discussing, he's also not necessarily saying that this is a perspective that we grow out of. And he does touch on this here, that basically these perspectives, while they are, again, separate categories that have been constructed, he does acknowledge that there is a fluidity here. That, again, because these categories don't really exist, there's much more fluidity to it, and he encourages us to keep that in mind when he says, on the other hand, we all slip into this perspective from one time to another, most obviously when we are dreaming, or daydreaming, I would add, but also when we engage in instinctive, automatic, or defensive behavior. So, and what he's saying is, while we all do start off here, in this autistic perspective, it is a fundamental perspective, and we all start off here, and most of us move on to more expansive perspectives in this progression, or these levels that Mr. Boeree is presenting us with. It is still a perspective that we are capable of shifting into at any given point in time, and that is generally the case for any of these perspectives, that while we might say that any given individual generally operates from a particular perspective, doesn't mean that they aren't still shifting into other perspectives, depending on the circumstances, depending on the topics of discussion, depending on various incidences that might happen. We can all there is a fluidity to it, which ties back into what I was talking about earlier, that these categories are not hard set. They are not, hardwired, or they're not strictly mutually exclusive. You can be operating from multiple perspectives at one time, actually, and you can consciously or unconsciously shift your perspective at any given time, because we all basically started there. And as he states, this tends to be more often than not during times when we are stressed or overwhelmed, or some of our more subconscious emotional issues or problematic core beliefs get triggered, and we can find ourselves in a very defensive state, and we can find ourselves taking on this autistic mindset. So more specifically about the autistic perspective, and this is my elaboration, my interpretation. But he's basically saying, this is, as he described it, an egocentric view where the individual sees their interpretation of reality to be the one and only interpretation of reality. And he's not saying this in like a judgmental way, we're not like use the word self-centered. Is not passing judgment, but just simply using it descriptively. The naming of the perspective as autistic is, appropriate to a degree, and what he's basically trying to just say is that this is a state of mind where, you're basically in your own world. And there's, I would say, a certain degree of detachment involved in this particular perspective. Okay, and then further down the page, he has a section entitled Morality that goes into specific discussions of morality for each perspective. So he says here, each of the 7 perspectives has a view of value, good and bad, as well, which follows pretty clearly from a perspective's overall description. And then he says here, for the autistic perspective, good is what pleases oneself, bad is what hurts. Morality is a simple, innocent hedonism. So he just sort of has like a one line about how we learn certain moral values, throughout our lives. And those values are, of course, generally constructed as well, just like categories. In fact, what he talks about here with the autistic perspective is basically the types of values that we assign to things based on how we experience them as pleasurable or painful. So if something gives us pleasure, then we attach a value to that thing that says this thing is good. So, for example, we like to eat a particular food, and that particular food tastes very good to us. Then we assign this value to that food. So if I say, I really like spaghetti. Spaghetti is really delicious when I eat it. I love the flavors, I love the textures. Spaghetti is good. That's the value, right? I attach that value to it. And from an autistic perspective, I would say spaghetti is good, and it would never even occur to me that perhaps spaghetti isn't good to some people. Like, it just, that's what he means by very, like, egocentric. And again, not saying it in a judgmental way. And again, we're not talking about necessarily autistic people. This is just a term that he's using in a very broad sense. I would say, after reading through all of the perspectives and the overall construction that he's sort of created here, I would say that it does have some hierarchical aspects to the way it's structured, but it has a more circular way in which it's structured, where the quote final, perspective actually is very similar to the initial perspective, the autistic perspective. So the final perspective is transcendental. And, obviously we'll have a video about that one later, but he talks about how it actually has some significant similarities to the autistic perspective. So you almost come full circle in a sense. But at the same time, there is sort of a progression as well. Yes. Alright, so that's going to do it for our first video, talking about the autistic perspective and getting an overall preview of the 7 perspectives that we're going to be discussing in this series. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe. The next video will be coming out soon. We are going to be talking about the authoritarian perspective, so keep an eye out for that. And until then, take care. We'll see you next time.